The saying goes, a picture is worth 1,000 words. So, how many words is a Steam banner worth? From storefront banners to cover art and more, key art is oftentimes one of the first ways a player may interact with a game, making it critical to get right. Our next speaker brings experience from Gearbox Publishing San Francisco in order to guide her talk, giving us some critical information and practical guidelines for making key art. Please welcome to the stage Rachel Runa.
Hello, thank you so much for coming to my talk about how to set up game key art and logos for success. My name's Rachel, and this is for Game Devs of Color Expo. To introduce today's topic, we have to bring up marketing assets, which are simply assets that market your game, but there are so many different kinds, they're everywhere. On a digital front, you have store and platform assets like Steam capsules or promotional assets on the PlayStation Store. There's also social media assets like banners on Twitter or YouTube thumbnails. Some examples of print marketing assets include booth signage at events and physical versions of games. Marketing assets are really the face of your game. And what do you use to make all these marketing assets? For the most part, key art and logos. With how important these files are, it's important to properly set them up for yourself if you're a solo developer who's making your own marketing assets, or for the person in or outside of your team who's handling that graphic design. Today's talk is going to be all about how to save time and resources by setting these files up properly so that you can use more of your effort toward creating high quality graphic design. Now, to introduce myself, my name is Rachel, and I'm a marketing designer at Gearbox Publishing San Francisco, with my previous work including what I've done at Raw Fury, but I'm not representing anyone or anything but myself for this presentation. That's one thing, and then the second thing is that the program that I'll be referencing throughout this presentation will be Adobe Photoshop, but I do hope that a lot of this will transfer over to whatever program that you're using. We'll look at a few tips about key art, then we'll learn a little bit more about logos, and then we'll take our learnings from the two and then take a look at how to approach designing marketing assets. I wanted to make sure that there was an example that I could use throughout this presentation from the beginning all the way to the end. So this is what I've created, and it's for a game that doesn't exist yet or ever, but it is something that you will see quite a bit. Here it is zoomed out, and please do take a look at the credits to see the artists for all of these elements. Just use everything within what the license allows. You can see all the different sites that I grabbed these from if you need any sort of resources to do a similar thing. The first point that I would like to make about key art is in regards to its dimensions. Game devs have asked me how big their key art should be, and a big learning that I would like you to take away from this is to work big. Having a bigger key art will allow you to make bigger assets, and then having a large canvas will make cropping and making cut downs much easier. Now, I'm sure you're cringing at the thought of opening PSDs with huge file sizes, and I get that. That's me sometimes. But what will be really helpful is if you save out different versions of your key art. So here I have the source file labeled as source. And then if I were to save out smaller file size versions or simplified versions with less layers, I would just differentiate that by labeling it in the file name. In addition to having key art that is high res, we also want it to be layered, which I'll be speaking more about later. So because we want it to be layered, PSDs are something that you probably really want to shoot for. And if you're getting your art commissioned, I highly recommend that in the deliverables, you do say that you want the PSD. For the rest of the suggestions that I have for specs, and of course, these are just suggestions like this entire presentation. They're not rules, and it's up to you, but they're separated into print and web, and the main difference will really depend on how important print assets will be towards your marketing efforts. If you know that they're going to be pretty important, then I would take the time to adjust the color of your key art in CYMK. You'll also see here the dimensions that I use for today's example key art. Again, it doesn't have to be these exact numbers, This is just what I used, and again, just work big. Circling back to layers, I think that a lot of people will already know this, and if you're an artist, you will know this all too well. But working in layers is just so essential. As a graphic designer, I want to work with layered art because I know that I'm going to be moving around elements a lot. I really suggest that your character and logo be separated from your background because it's these three layers that platforms such as Apple will ask for when you're sending over your source files. So for my example, you can see that I have the background, character, and logo on their own layers, and I also have a foreground. But personally, this would be for the simplified version of my key art because as much as possible, I think it's good to have elements on their own separate layers because there will be times where I want to move over like rock or a cloud or a particle. And so by having them all on their own layers, you can do that for them on an individual basis. You can really end up with a lot of different layers. So naming things and putting them in groups will only do good. And here in my example, I took the top elements there and grouped them into the sky. And then that, along with the mountains and the water, make the background. Here are some recommended layers and groups for key art, and I'm going to give a special call out to adjustments and effects because these things are nice to be able to toggle on and off. Now that we've gone over layers, let's talk about some other techniques and tools that will aid you in the creation of your key art, starting with smart objects. And you can see the definition that Adobe has here. But I like to think of it simply as I make a layer, a smart object, and the original image is protected. In Photoshop, it is a big deal to work non-destructively. When you have a regular raster layer and you do something like descaling it and then upscaling it after doing that, you can see that there is a loss in quality. But if you turn the layer into a smart object and do the same thing, the original image is protected, and so there won't be that loss in quality. The next technique or tool that I want to talk about is the idea of extended backgrounds. So at the top there, you can see if the key art only had that amount of background. If I'm using the full width of the background for some application that is wide, I can't fit in the water. I can't get more of the story that the key art is trying to tell. So what would be really helpful is if the key art was zoomed back and the background was filled in, more like you can see there at the bottom. The third and last sort of technique is elements in full. And so what I mean by that is elements that are farther into the background that are covered by something in front of it. They're not drawn around that thing that's in front of it. They're actually there in full. And a good example of this is in the example key art. You can see that when the owl and the rock have been taken out, that the grass could have a big hole. But because it's actually masked, it's actually there in full. And so if you wanted just the grass in front of the character, it would look as it should. So once you're all done with your key art source file, it's good to turn it into cut downs by cropping it. You'll see that a lot of store and platform assets or even social media banners will be around these aspect ratios and sizes that I have here on the left. You have that 16 by 9, 3 by 4, a 1 by 1, which is a square. These are all very common crops. You'll export them as PNGs and JPEGs as you need them, but I highly recommend that you do save them as PSDs as well so you don't have to redo any work and you can just open the PSD if you need to make any sort of adjustments. And you can also see here that to fit the restrictions of the width and height, I did rearrange some elements, and you can really see this in the constellations as they have different layouts. Again, that's why it's good to have all of these elements on their own layer. Moving on to logos. The file type and dimensions of your logo will really depend on what program that you're going to use for your logos, and that will further depend on the look of your logos. So, for example, if you have a logo that is a little bit more 3D like and has a bunch of different effects, personally, I would use Photoshop for that, and it would be a PSD, and I would probably make the dimensions around 8K. But if your logo is going to be a little bit more flat, then maybe it's best to use Adobe Illustrator and then make that an AI, in which case it would be a vector and you don't really have to think about the limitations of a raster and what dimensions to make it. Whether you have a more 3D looking logo or a more flat logo, when it comes to the color of that logo, it's nice to make sure that it will work on a variety of backgrounds. And if you if it doesn't, then you can have light and dark versions of your logo and then just define when exactly to use them. So here in the example, you can see that some colors are more visible than others on different backgrounds, particularly the pink one. And especially for the other fake logo that I created at the bottom, you can see that with that range of color, toward the end of the logo there, it starts to get a little lost in the pink. Simplifying your game's logo to be a one color vector will be a super convenient addition to have. As you can see here, the fake logo that I made fits in really well with the other white logos. And another example of this is when you need to have your logo up against your developer logo, publisher logo, platform logo. It will blend in really well. And speaking of your developer logo, make sure to give that some attention as well. Games with really long names will really benefit from having both a horizontal and vertical version. When it comes to placing your logo on your key art, it will highly depend on the composition of your key art. When I have gotten both the key art and logos of games separately and needed to find a spot for the logo, I would look at the place with the least amount of noise where the logo will provide some balance. And if you need to move the characters or any sort of elements around, you should do so. And here are the suggestions that I have for that main version of your logo and that one color vector. Now that we've learned more about logos, we're going to take what we learned and what we learned earlier about key art and look at how to approach designing marketing assets. I have some do's and don'ts, starting with do. Use provided templates and review requirements. And a good example of this is when it comes to designing store assets, you don't want them rejected by PlayStation or Xbox just because you have the wrong size or you place things in the wrong spot. Keep things consistent and utilize established crops. Again, like we saw earlier with the crops, these are very common aspect ratios that those platforms will ask for. Ensure that your assets get the essence of your game, even if elements are removed or rearranged. Maybe you'll take out a secondary character or an object in the background, but you can ask yourself, does your asset still convey what you want it to? As for some don'ts, don't lose track of adjustment layers and effects. Drop shadows, Gaussian blurs, they can get really weird. These smart filters can get really weird if you resize them, so it's good to keep an eye on them. The other thing to really look out for is any fill layers or just layers that have just a fill of color or texture. If you don't move them over the whole art, you'll notice that it cuts off. There's a line that shows where you cut it off. So make sure that that's brought out to where it needs to be on your art. Don't cut off characters or elements in weird spots, and don't forget about padding and breathing room when it comes to designing assets. Let's focus a little bit on store assets. You want to be aware of critical areas and art safe zones in those templates that I mentioned earlier. Again, you don't want your art looking off or weird because of some additional overlay that's placed on top of it, or maybe it's actually going to be cropped at a certain point. And so you just want to make sure that you're following what the template is asking for. Next, there can be a lot of store assets. Artboards are basically where you can have multiple assets within one PSD, and it's really nice so that you can check the consistency across your assets, but do just know that the file size can get pretty big, and sometimes you'll need an individual PSD for an asset because that is actually required. Now, when it comes to creating store assets, there are a few ways that you can go about it in terms of like actually creating it. The first way is to just copy and paste the layers of your key art and logo into like the template. You can also file place them, or you can just take those existing crops and cut downs of your key art and then just resize it from there, resize and adjust the canvas. It really is up to you and your workflow, like what your preferences are. Personally, I do both. Just depends on how I'm feeling, I guess. These next few tips are for store assets in general, but I think it would be good to look at them through the lens of Steam capsules. So the first tip that I have is to see how your assets will look up against the UI of the store or platform they'll be on, in this case Steam. And then the second tip is to see how your assets will look against other games or the competition. So for Steam, I use the small capsule here, and I have two other examples of fake games for this presentation as well. And you can see how they look up against each other. And that bottom example in particular really stands out, right? This is a slide to catch some of the other types of assets. That could be social media. We have a giveaway banner, trailer thumbnail for YouTube, and some user acquisition banners. And the main thing that I really want to emphasize for this is to make sure that there is room for copy and call to action. So to zoom in on each of these assets that we have here, how I would approach creating a game key giveaway banner, and this is all very subjective on my creative process, but I like to make space for all of the copy and call to action like I mentioned earlier, so I will place any kind of characters and objects on the right side, leaving us with a lot of space to work with on the left. Of course, we want to have the logo of the game there so that whoever's looking at it can see that this is for that game. I put giveaway in very big text so that people know what this is all about. And this is very me, but I cannot have something just say giveaway. I need there to be some more copy so that people know what it is being given away. And other examples that I didn't know really fit this game, examples of real work. It could be like a HyperX headset, or it could be a case, a PC case with the key art of the game on it. But in this case, it's a game key. And then I have the that's the developer logo, which is my own logo, and then a fake publisher logo on there as well. So for this asset, I already know that I have moved over the constellations quite a bit so that it does not hit any of the copy and CTAs because that is very important. Now to move over to the trailer thumbnail, again, keeping the constellations out of the way of the logo and the copy, which is announcement trailer here. One thing that I've really noticed for thumbnails of present day is there is a focus on the character, and the character, or it could be an object, will be really big. Announcement trailer as copy can be very long, so there are different ways to go about that. You could stack the text. In this case, I just left it as one piece of horizontal text. When it comes to user acquisition banners, the one thing that you will always have on there are buttons, which is also the call to action. In this case, learn more. The copy will maybe it will be when it's releasing or when early access is or that it's coming soon in general. It depends on where you're at with your game. But some optimal placement for the copy will be directly under the logo. And then to keep everything reading top to bottom, you would have the button right underneath that copy. And in the case of the more vertical UA banner, I do have the button at the very bottom. You can see that the more square UA banner has the same sort of layout as the giveaway banner where I've placed everything to the right so that I have space on the left. And it's all about creating less noise behind the copy and CTA, which are very important. To summarize everything that we've talked about today, we went over key art, some suggested dimensions and other specs, what it means for your key art to be layered, some tools, and then what it means to crop and cut down your key art. Then we went into logos, some settings, one color logos, vectors, the horizontal or vertical orientation of your logo, and how to place it on key art, and then we summarize everything. Then we took what we learned from our key art and logo discussion, and we looked at how to approach marketing assets. We had some do's and don'ts. We looked at store assets, in particular Steam capsules, and then looked at some other assets. Cool. Now I'm going to go ahead and open up this talk to any questions that you might have. Feel free to leave them in the chat and I will go ahead and answer them. I should be here live in person to type out some answers, but I also thought it would be helpful to have me still talking and answer questions that I think would be nice to have answers to. So the first question is, what are your thoughts on having more than one piece of key art? There are two situations that I think of when I read this question. So one situation is you have placeholder art, or you simply want to create and have something better that represents your game closer to launch. So placeholder art is something that is meant to be replaced, and you should definitely go for it. And then when it comes to refreshing your key art, I think you have to ask yourself, are you okay with these different versions both going around the internet? You should be prepared for that older piece of art to still be seen in searches. People will still use it in their articles, their thumbnails, if even if there is like a new piece of key art that you have. And if that older piece of key art really still works and you're not cool with the things that I just mentioned, maybe you can just stick to it. But if you feel like that piece of key art just doesn't represent your game as well as it could, then you can certainly make a new key art and take that opportunity to have a marketing beat around that. The second situation is intentionally having multiple pieces of key art so there's a variety to choose from. I think ultimately there will always be that sort of main piece of key art, the one that you use on box art, for example. And then maybe you can have some other special pieces of key art for merch or other use cases. And I think this is actually really helpful if you can allocate resources to this effort. Again, I just recommend choosing one that you like best to be the one, you know? Moving on to the second question, what sort of asset should I upload into a press kit? In your press kit, I recommend uploading 1. Key art and cutdowns as PNG or JPEG exports, and then 2. Full color, black or white, or both versions of your game, developer or studio, and publisher logo if you have one. I would not recommend uploading your source files. I think that's too much power for anyone to have to be able to do whatever with your files. Before I go into the last question that I have for myself to answer, I just wanted to remind everybody that you can leave a question in the chat and I will answer through text. If you don't feel like asking right now, you can reach out to me on social media. Going into that last question, where should I look for artists who can draw my key art? You can see what artists your network has to recommend to you through social media. Maybe you're looking for an artist with a certain type of style, in which case I think researching artists yourself will be really helpful. ArtStation is an example of a place that I've observed other people using. Either way, at some point, you're going to want to have a creative brief that details the project and what you're looking for. Well, that's really it for today. Thank you so much for coming. You can follow me on social media for more adventures in Photoshop. And I do want to let everyone know that I do have a credits page so you can see where I get all of my resources from. Thank you so much again. Bye bye!
I already thought that Cartomancy Anthology was a heck of a project before this talk, but now that I have more information, I have an even greater appreciation for the compilation of stories and experiences that this anthology provides. Game dev projects go through all sorts of struggles. And regardless of the struggles that this project went through, I appreciate how many positives Cheska and Samantha were able to find and bring to the stage, as well as some vulnerable lessons learned that I hope will guide all of us to stronger projects in the future. Thanks so much, Cheska and Samantha.